Colorado Territory, 1875. The wind whistled through Whisper Creek, a settlement perched on the edge of civilization where the Rocky Mountains kissed the prairie. Most folks said the frontier was no place for tenderness, that survival demanded hardness of heart as much as calluses on hands. Kieran McAllister believed this more than most. At 26, he'd already lived several lifetimes of solitude, convinced that attachment was a luxury no cowboy could afford. The trail was his home, loneliness his only faithful companion. Man wasn't meant to put down roots in this country. Kieran often told himself while riding fence lines on the Lazy S ranch where he worked. Roots just give the storm something to tear up. His lean, muscular frame bore the evidence of years in the saddle, skin tanned by relentless sun, eyes the color of summer sage that had witnessed too much frontier justice to trust in softness. Despite the harshness etched into his features, there remained something boyish in his clean-shaven face that no amount of trail dust could quite conceal. Kieran had wandered west after the war, carrying little more than his father's colt, a decent saddle, and the conviction that loving anything meant losing it. The West seemed the perfect place for a man determined to keep his distance. Yet sometimes, in the quiet moments before dawn when the stars still hung like silver dollars in the sky, an ache would settle in his chest, not for what he had lost, but for what he had never allowed himself to find. 20 miles of hard riding from the Lazy S stood Whisper Creek, where the twice-monthly supply run brought Kieran reluctantly into town. It was on one such errand, with spring mud still clinging to his boots, that fate decided to challenge every belief he held dear. Primrose Vance was 19, with hair the color of wheat fields at sunset and eyes blue as Colorado skies. Unlike most frontier women worn down by hardship, she possessed a quiet radiance that seemed to defy the harsh landscape. Her father had been Whisper Creek's doctor until typhoid took him the previous winter, leaving Primrose alone with their small cottage, his medical books, and the bakery she had started to supplement their income. The West may break your back, but it needn't break your spirit, her father had taught her. Primrose believed in creating beauty where others saw only survival. Each loaf of bread she shaped was an act of defiance against the wilderness, proof that even in a land of thorns, something tender could flourish. On that particular April morning in 1875, while arranging fresh loaves in her shop window, Primrose glanced up to see a tall figure dismounting outside. The cowboy moved with the easy grace of someone more comfortable on horseback than on foot. When he entered her shop, the small bell above the door announced his arrival with a cheerful clarity that seemed at odds with his wary expression. "Morning, ma'am," Kieran said, removing his hat. Dust from the trail lightly coated his clothes, but couldn't disguise the strong line of his jaw or the wariness in his eyes. "Foreman sent me to fetch supplies. Said your bread might be worth the extra miles." Primrose smiled, noting how he positioned himself with his back to the wall, eyes automatically scanning the room. "Your foreman has good taste. Just pulled fresh loaves from the oven." She gestured to the warm bread cooling on racks behind her. "First time in Whisper Creek." "Passing through mostly," Kieran replied. The scent of fresh bread stirred memories he'd long suppressed, of a farmhouse kitchen back in Tennessee, before the war had taken his family and his faith in permanent things. Their hands brushed as she passed him a loaf wrapped in brown paper. Something electric and unfamiliar passed between them, causing Kieran to step back abruptly, nearly knocking over a display of jars. "Careful there," Primrose said, reaching out to steady the wobbling shelf. "No need to run. The bread won't bite." "It's not the bread I'm worried about, ma'am." The words slipped out before he could catch them. Her laughter, unexpected and genuine, caught him off guard. "Well, I don't bite either, Mr. McAllister." "Kieran McAllister." "Primrose Vance." She extended her hand with a directness uncommon for frontier women. "My friends call me Prim, though there's some debate about whether the name suits me." Kieran hesitated before taking her hand, feeling as though he stood at the edge of a precipice. "I reckon names don't always capture the whole truth of a person. Perhaps the first honest thing anyone said to me all week," she replied, her eyes holding his a moment too long for comfort. "Will you be riding through again, Mr. McAllister?" The question hung between them, weighted with possibility. Kieran knew the sensible answer. A noncommittal maybe that would preserve the distance he'd so carefully cultivated. Instead, he heard himself saying. 2 Sundays from now. Ranch business. As he rode back to the Lazy S that afternoon, Kieran couldn't shake the memory of Primrose's smile or the strange lightness in his chest. He tried to dismiss it as hunger satisfied or the pleasant relief of completing his errand, but deep down, he recognized the danger. For the first time in years, something had cracked the armor he'd forged around himself, and that something smelled of fresh bread and had eyes like summer skies. 2 weeks passed with excruciating slowness. When Kieran finally returned to Whisper Creek, he found himself taking extra care with his appearance, washing trail dust from his face in the creek and combing his dark hair before entering town. He told himself it was simple respect for civilization, nothing more. The bakery was closed when he arrived, it being Sunday, but as he stood uncertainly outside, the side door opened and Primrose appeared, flour dusting her blue calico dress. "You're punctual, Mr. McAllister," she called, wiping her hands on her apron. "Most cowboys I know consider time a loose suggestion. Ranch work teaches precision," he replied, suddenly aware of his empty hands. He should have brought something. But what did one bring to a woman who created sustenance for an entire town? "I'm baking for the week," she said, gesturing toward the door. "Would you care to come in? There's coffee on the stove." Every instinct warned Kieran to decline, to purchase his bread and retreat to familiar solitude. Yet he found himself following her inside, into the warm sanctuary of her kitchen where the yeasty scent of rising dough filled the air. That Sunday afternoon stretched into evening as they talked. Primrose spoke of her father's practice, of learning to bake from her mother who had died when she was 12, of her determination to remain independent despite the town council's hints that a young woman alone should consider marriage for protection, if nothing else. "And you?" she asked, serving him a third slice of apple pie. "What drives a man to embrace solitude in a land that already has too much of it?" The question cut closer to bone than Kieran expected. He stared into his coffee cup, surprised to find himself answering honestly. "I've seen what happens when people build their lives around others. The war took my family, took my home, taught me that attachment is just pain waiting to happen." Primrose considered this, her eyes thoughtful. "My father used to say that pain isn't something to avoid at all costs. It's the price we pay for caring deeply." "Steep price?" Kieran murmured. "Yes," she agreed. "But is the alternative any less costly?" When Kieran rode out that evening, his saddlebags contained 3 loaves of fresh bread, and his mind was troubled with questions he'd avoided for years. The next morning found him scouring the prairie near the ranch house, gathering the first wildflowers of spring before his dawn shift. "Taking up botany, McAllister?" the foreman asked, eyebrows raised as Kieran mounted up with the small bouquet, secured carefully in his saddlebag. "Just an errand," Kieran replied, offering no further explanation as he rode the 20 miles to Whisper Creek in the pale morning light. Primrose's cottage stood at the edge of town, a modest structure with a small garden beginning to show green with spring promise. Kieran approached silently, suddenly uncertain. This gesture seemed foolish in the clear light of day, a sentimental impulse unbecoming of a man who prided himself on practicality. Before he could retreat, the door opened and Primrose emerged, already dressed for her day at the bakery. She stopped short at the sight of him standing awkwardly in her yard, wildflowers clutched in his hand. "Mr. McAllister," she said, surprise evident in her voice. "Is something wrong?" "No, ma'am," he replied, extending the flowers with uncharacteristic hesitation. "Just thought these might brighten your window. Small thanks for the bread." Something in Primrose's expression shifted, a softness entering her eyes that made Kieran's breath catch. "No one's brought me flowers since my father died," she said quietly, accepting the bouquet. Her fingers brushed his, lingering just long enough to send warmth up his arm. "Thank you." As weeks passed, a pattern emerged. Every Sunday, Kieran rode to Whisper Creek, where Primrose would have fresh bread waiting. Their conversations deepened as spring melted into summer, haltingly at first, then with growing ease. And every Monday, without fail, Kieran would leave wildflowers on her porch before dawn, often riding through darkness to ensure he completed his delivery before returning to ranch duties. The townsfolk noticed, of course. Gossip traveled faster than telegrams in frontier settlements. "You're courting that baker girl, ain't you?" Samuel, one of the older ranch hands, observed one evening as they sat by the fire. Mighty long ride, just for bread. Kieran stiffened. Just being neighborly. Sure, Samuel chuckled. And I'm just growing this beard to keep birds from nesting on my face. The truth was, Kieran hardly understood his own actions. Every instinct honed by years of self-preservation screamed against the path he was traveling. Yet each Sunday found him riding toward Whisper Creek rather than away. Each conversation with Primrose dismantling another brick in the wall he'd built around his heart. By midsummer, their Sunday ritual had expanded. After church, which Kieran had reluctantly begun attending, they would walk along the creek that gave the town its name. Primrose would identify the wildflowers and plants, knowledge gleaned from her father's medical books, while Kieran found himself sharing stories of cattle drives and stars used for navigation, things he'd never bothered telling anyone before. Why wildflowers? Primrose asked one sultry August afternoon as they sat beside the water. Every Monday, without fail. You must rise before the sun to deliver them and still make it back for your duties. Kieran watched the water ripple over stones, gathering courage. They remind me of you, he finally said. Growing in unlikely places. Bringing beauty where most just see hardship. He paused, then added quietly. And maybe I needed to prove something could survive my attention. Primrose's hand found his, her touch featherlight, yet anchoring. And has this experiment yielded results, Mr. McAllister? Too early to tell, he replied, though the quickening of his pulse suggested otherwise. Their first kiss came with autumn's first chill, after Kieran helped repair Primrose's roof before the coming winter. The moment was unplanned, her standing on her porch, thanking him suddenly unable to imagine riding away again without knowing the taste of her smile. When their lips met, something fundamental shifted in Kieran's universe, as if all the stars had realigned around this single point of warmth. I should go, he whispered afterward, even as his hands remained gently curved around her waist. Yes, she agreed, making no move to step away. You probably should. Neither moved for a long while. October brought cattle drives and separation as Kieran traveled with the herd to market. For 6 weeks, no wildflowers appeared on Primrose's porch, no cowboy came for Sunday bread. She found herself standing at her window each Monday morning anyway, scanning the empty street with a hollow feeling beneath her ribs. The separation crystallized what both had been reluctant to name. When Kieran finally returned in November, thinner and trail-worn, the sight of Primrose waiting at the edge of town with a basket over her arm nearly undid him. I thought you might be hungry, she said simply, offering bread still warm from the oven. Kieran dismounted slowly, his eyes never leaving her face. I thought of you every night, he admitted, the words rushing out as if a dam had broken. Under different stars, across rivers and mountains, I kept thinking about coming back. And here you are, she replied, her smile tremulous. Here I am, he echoed, wondering at how 4 words could feel so monumental. That winter proved one of the harshest in memory. Snow piled in drifts taller than men, and temperatures plummeted to deadly lows. Yet every Sunday, Kieran made the journey to Whisper Creek, sometimes traveling on snowshoes when drifts made riding impossible. And every Monday, without fail, wildflowers appeared on Primrose's porch, hothouse blooms purchased at considerable expense from the nearest large town when nature provided none. It was during the February blizzard of 1876 that their story nearly ended before it truly began. Kieran, determined to maintain their tradition despite the ranch foreman's warnings, set out on Sunday morning through swirling snow. Halfway to town, the storm intensified, transforming the familiar landscape into a disorienting white void. When his horse stumbled into a snow-covered ravine, throwing Kieran against rocks before bolting in panic, he found himself alone in the worsening blizzard with a badly twisted ankle and no shelter in sight. As consciousness wavered, one thought sustained him. Primrose would be waiting with bread and warmth. In Whisper Creek, Primrose paced her kitchen, watching the snow build against her windows. No cowboy would ride in such conditions. It would be madness. Yet as hours passed, and the storm showed no signs of abating, a terrible certainty grew within her. Kieran McAllister was a man of absolute consistency, and if he had promised to come, nothing short of death would prevent him. He's just being sensible, she told herself, staying safely at the ranch. but the bread cooling on her counter testified to her true expectations. When the knock came at her door near dusk, hope leapt in her chest, only to find Sheriff Davies standing on her porch, snow crusting his mustache. "Miss Vance," he said gravely. "McAllister's horse just staggered into town without him. Saddle's empty." What followed tested everything Primrose believed about frontier strength. Against the sheriff's protests, she insisted on joining the search party, loading her father's medical bag with supplies and remedies for exposure. They found Kieran half buried in snow, barely conscious, his face blue-tinged with cold. For 3 days, Primrose fought for his life in her small cottage, applying her father's medical knowledge with desperate precision. When fever followed the initial cold, she sat beside him through delirious nights, cooling his brow and listening as secrets spilled from his unguarded lips. Confessions of love mingled with old terrors, declarations of devotion interwoven with fears of abandonment. On the 4th morning, Kieran woke clear-eyed to find Primrose asleep in a chair beside his bed, her hand still holding his. In that moment, watching her breathe in the pale winter sunlight, the last of his defenses crumbled. The false belief that had guided his adult life, that love was too dangerous to risk, that attachment meant inevitable pain, revealed itself as the prison it had always been. "Prim," he whispered, squeezing her hand gently. She startled awake, relief flooding her features as she saw awareness in his eyes. "You're back," she said, voice thick with exhaustion and emotion. "I'm sorry about Sunday bread," he managed, his voice rough from disuse. A laugh caught in Primrose's throat, emerging as something between a sob and a chuckle. "Of all the fool things to apologize for," she said, bringing his hand to her cheek. "I love you," Kieran said simply. The words, so long avoided, felt like finally coming home. "I've been fighting it because I thought loving meant losing, but I was already losing by not loving." Primrose's eyes filled with tears. It took nearly dying in a blizzard to realize this. "I'm a slow learner," he admitted with the ghost of a smile. "But I'm asking if you'll teach me anyway. How to build something that lasts. How to put down roots without fearing the storm." As February gave way to March, and Kieran's strength gradually returned, changes rippled through both their lives. He resigned from the Lazy S, accepting a position as deputy sheriff in Whisper Creek, work that kept him close to town while using the skills he'd honed on the frontier. The tiny room behind Primrose's bakery became his temporary home, though gossip ensured they maintained strict propriety, with Kieran sleeping at the sheriff's office until matters could be properly formalized. Their courtship, already unusual by frontier standards, continued with new depth. Every Sunday, Primrose baked bread they now shared together after church. Every Monday, wildflowers appeared on her porch, even though Kieran now lived within shouting distance. The ritual had transformed from gesture to covenant, a weekly renewal of promises being kept. Spring arrived with unexpected news that threatened their fragile happiness. A telegram reached Whisper Creek announcing that Primrose's uncle, her only living relative, had died in Chicago, leaving her a modest inheritance and a small bookshop. The letter accompanying this news urged her to return east, arguing that a young woman of intelligence deserved better than frontier hardship. "You should consider it," Kieran said that evening as they walked by the creek, the paper still clutched in Primrose's hand. Each word cost him dearly, but he forced them out anyway. A real city. Books. Culture. Things a woman like you deserves. Primrose stopped walking to study his face. "Is that what you want? For me to go?" "What I want doesn't matter," Kieran replied, his expression carefully neutral. "I want what's best for you." "Then you should know better," she said firmly. "My home is here. My life is here." She paused, gathering courage. "My heart is here." The relief that washed over Kieran's features betrayed how much the prospect of losing her had terrified him. "I'd have followed you," he admitted, "if you'd chosen to go. All the way to Chicago." "I know," Primrose said softly. "That's why I never had to consider it." When Kieran finally knelt before her with a ring, a simple band he'd commissioned from silver taken from his own spurs, the question seemed almost unnecessary. Yet he asked it properly, on a Sunday evening in May as sunset painted the mountains gold. "You've taught me that loving isn't losing," he said, his voice steady despite the trembling in his hands. "It's finding what was missing. I spent years convinced that the frontier was no place for tenderness, that survival meant keeping everyone at arm's length. You proved me wrong with every loaf of bread, with every conversation that made me want to be better than I was. Primrose's eyes shone as she looked down at this man who had traveled so far, both in distance and spirit, to reach this moment. Yes, she whispered, before he could even finish asking. 1,000 times yes. They married in June 1876 as Colorado became a state, a coincidence that Primrose declared auspicious. New beginnings all around. The entire town turned out for the celebration, the church overflowing with well-wishers and curious onlookers drawn by the story of the bread and wildflowers that had gradually become local legend. With Primrose's inheritance and Kieran's savings, they purchased land at the edge of town, enough for a proper home with rooms for children they hoped would come, a larger bakery facing the main street, and even space for the small medical practice Primrose had begun developing, using her father's books and instruments to serve those who couldn't afford the new doctor's fees. On their first Monday as husband and wife, Primrose woke to find wildflowers not on her porch, but on her pillow. Kieran watched, propped on one elbow, as she buried her face in the blooms. Some traditions should continue, he said, drawing her close. As should others, she replied, kissing him before slipping from bed to begin the bread that would grace their table that evening and the town's breakfast the following day. By autumn, the first signs of new life grew within Primrose, and Kieran's protective instincts emerged with an intensity that both amused and touched her. The man who had once believed attachment was too dangerous to risk now placed his hand reverently on her growing belly each night, whispering promises to their unborn child. I used to think loving meant inevitable loss, he confessed one evening as they sat on the porch of their new home, watching twilight settle over the mountains. Now I understand it's the only thing that makes any of this worthwhile. Primrose leaned against his shoulder, her hand entwined with his. And the bread? The flowers? What do they mean now that we've built this life together? Kieran considered this, watching as the first stars appeared above the darkening peaks. They remind me that love isn't just grand gestures or declarations, he said slowly. It's consistency, showing up when expected, creating beauty where you can, finding ways to say, I'm still here, even when words fail. When their daughter arrived the following spring, healthy and strong-lunged, with her mother's golden hair and her father's sage-green eyes, they named her Hope, for what had brought them together against all odds. And as the years passed and more children joined their family, as the bakery thrived and the town grew around them, Kieran and Primrose maintained their quiet ritual. Every Sunday, she baked bread they shared around a table that expanded to accommodate children, then eventually grandchildren. Every Monday, wildflowers appeared, on the porch in summer, beside her plate in winter, without fail for 50 years of changing seasons. Whisper Creek grew from settlement to proper town, eventually connecting to the railroad that brought progress and new faces. Through it all, the bakery stood as a cornerstone of the community, and the McAllister home remained a place where weary travelers and neighbors alike found welcome. The frontier softened around them, or perhaps they softened it through their stubborn insistence that tenderness could survive in harsh places. Did you ever imagine this? Primrose asked on their 50th anniversary, as they sat in rocking chairs watching their grandchildren play in the yard where Kieran had once stood awkwardly with his first offering of wildflowers. Kieran, his dark hair now silver, but his eyes still bright with the same light that had gradually awakened during those Sunday conversations so long ago, shook his head. I couldn't have imagined it, he replied, taking her hand in his. I didn't have the vocabulary for happiness back then. And now? She asked, the lines around her eyes deepening with her smile. Now I know what the poets meant, he said simply. About home being a person, not a place. About love being the greatest act of courage. When visitors to Whisper Creek asked about the town's history, locals invariably told the story of the cowboy who left wildflowers and the woman who baked bread, how their small acts of faith in each other had flourished into a legacy that transformed not just their own lives, but the character of the frontier itself. Some called it a legend, embellished by time. But those who knew Kieran and Primrose McAllister understood the truth, that in a land where survival often demanded hardness, their greatest achievement had been proving that tenderness could not only endure, but thrive. That love, expressed in consistent actions rather than grand gestures, could transform the wilderness itself into home.